The desert sun was burning on the golden palace walls, but inside the royal chambers the air was colder than stone. The alien princess sat still on a silver seat, her hands trembling slightly as servants wrapped her in layers of ceremonial armor. The armor was heavy, covered in fine patterns, but even its shine could not hide the fear that lived in her eyes. Today was the day she would meet the human warrior who was chosen to be her groom. From the time she was a child, she had heard stories about humans. Her tutors had spoken of their power, their violent nature, their endless wars. Soldiers told tales of humans breaking entire fleets with a single warship. Priests whispered that humans were cursed with fire in their blood. To her people, humans were not allies. They were monsters forced into peace only because the galaxy feared what they might do if left unchecked. And now, she, the only daughter of the royal bloodline, was bound to one of them. She could not understand why her father, the emperor, had agreed to this union. Diplomacy, they called it. A bridge between two species. A marriage that would prevent another war. But to her it felt like punishment. She was being sacrificed for peace, chained to a creature she had been raised to fear. Her ladies-in-waiting adjusted her braids, weaving them tightly, as if preparing her for battle. The princess's heart beat harder with every passing moment. She tried to steady her breath, but her mind painted horrible pictures of what was to come. She imagined a towering figure with a cruel face, scars running across his skin, eyes filled with hunger for blood. She imagined hands strong enough to break her bones without effort. She imagined her future as a life of silence and submission, trapped beside someone who would never see her as more than a prize. "Do not look into his eyes," one of the older servants whispered, as she tightened the golden neck guard. "Humans can crush your will with a glance." The words made her shiver. She wanted to speak, to protest, but her throat felt dry. Her people saw her as strong, proud, destined to rule. Yet at that moment she felt like a child once again, afraid of shadows in the dark. The sound of drums began to echo outside, slow, steady, powerful. Each beat was a reminder that the time was drawing near. The marriage ceremony would take place in the grand hall, where thousands of her people were already gathered. It would not be a private event. It would be a show, a declaration to the galaxy that the Empire and the humans were now joined, and she was at the center of it whether she wished it or not. 2 guards entered the chamber, their armor gleaming under the torchlight. They bowed low and announced that the human groom had arrived at the gates. The princess's stomach turned. Her hands went cold. She wanted to run, to hide, to escape into the endless desert outside, but her duty chained her to the seat more tightly than any iron could. She rose slowly, every step heavy. The hallways stretched before her like tunnels leading to judgment. She could hear the roar of the crowd beyond the doors. Banners of gold and crimson waved above, filling the air with color, but her eyes saw only the future she dreaded. As the princess reached the grand doors, she stopped for a moment. Her heart pounded so hard it almost hurt. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother's voice, long gone but still remembered. "Courage is not the absence of fear, my daughter. Courage is walking forward even when fear tries to break you." The doors opened. Light flooded the hall. The grand chamber was filled with her people. Rows of soldiers stood in silver ranks. Nobles lined the edges, whispering behind jeweled masks. High above, the emperor watched from his throne, his face unreadable. But none of this mattered because at the far end of the chamber stood the human groom. He was tall, his figure strong, his presence heavy. He wore armor darker than night, polished yet scarred from battles unknown. His face was hidden behind a helmet that reflected the flames of the torches. The crowd murmured as he stepped forward. Each step echoed across the chamber like thunder, sending chills through the princess's body. She tried to steady herself, but her fear only grew. This was the monster from the stories, the ruthless warrior who had crushed fleets and silenced kings. She could not see his eyes, but she imagined them cold and merciless. Her hands curled into fists, hidden under her golden sleeves. The human stopped a few steps away. He bowed slightly, not as a servant, but as an equal. The sound of metal shifting filled the air as he reached for his helmet. The hall fell silent. Even the crowd seemed to hold its breath. The princess's heart raced. This was the moment she had dreaded all her life, the first look at the face of the one who would bind her fate. She told herself she would see a monster. She told herself she must be ready for cruelty. The helmet lifted. Light touched his face. Her breath caught. Instead of cruelty, she saw something she had not expected. His eyes were not filled with rage but with something else entirely, and for the first time, her fear was replaced not with relief but with confusion. The silence inside the grand hall was so deep that even the sound of the princess's own breathing seemed too loud. The human warrior stood before her, his helmet now lifted from his head. What she expected to see was a face of cruelty, sharp like a blade, with eyes that promised only pain. But what she saw was something that unsettled her in a very different way. His face was strong, marked by scars that told stories of battles fought long before this day. Yet the scars were not worn like trophies. They were quiet, heavy, and almost sorrowful. His skin was pale under the torchlight, his jaw sharp, but it was his eyes that struck her most. They were not wild or cruel. They carried weight, deep like oceans, filled not with hunger for war but with memories of it. The princess froze. Her fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. It was no longer fear of being crushed by a monster. It was fear of not understanding what stood before her. Who was this man, this human groom? The hall whispered all around her. Nobles leaned closer to one another. Soldiers shifted uneasily, as if uncertain whether they were seeing a human at all. For years, humans had been painted as beasts, and yet here stood one, not as beast but as something far more complicated. The emperor raised his hand, silencing the crowd. His deep voice echoed across the chamber. "Daughter, behold the warrior who stands before you, the one who has agreed to this union, not for power, not for conquest, but for peace. Do you see him now?" The princess wanted to answer, but her tongue was heavy. She lowered her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the human. His eyes met hers. She felt a sudden pull, as if his stare carried a storm of unspoken words. Her chest tightened. She tried to hold her posture, to look proud as a princess should, but her heart betrayed her with every quick beat. The human did not speak at once. He simply stood tall and calm like a soldier awaiting orders. Finally his lips parted. His voice was low, steady, and deeper than she expected. "I am not here to frighten you." The words cut through the silence like a blade. Gasps rose from the crowd. No human had spoken in the royal chamber before. The alien priest glared in disapproval, yet the princess's mind clung to the sound of his voice. It was not harsh. It was not commanding. It was human. Her steps wavered, but she forced herself forward, closing the distance between them by a single pace. She lifted her chin, though her body trembled beneath the armor. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her voice faint but sharp enough for all to hear. The human's gaze did not falter. "Because our leaders have chosen this path. Because if we do not stand side by side, then one day we will stand as enemies again. And I am tired of war." The hall erupted in whispers. The alien advisors shifted in anger, but the emperor only watched. The princess could not speak at first. The words sounded too simple, too plain, but in them she felt something heavy. Truth. Still, she could not trust him so easily. She remembered the warnings, the dark tales, the whispers of human cruelty. Her people had bled because of humans before. Could this single man change what she believed? The ceremony continued, though the princess barely heard the words of the priests. Her eyes remained on the human. He did not move unless required. When he bowed, it was with discipline. When he lifted his head, it was with calm. There was no arrogance, no hunger for domination. But there was something else, something she could not yet name. When the rituals ended, they were led into a smaller chamber to share their first private meeting. Guards lined the doors, their weapons closed, but none followed inside. For the first time, it was only the princess and the human. The chamber was quiet, filled with dim golden light. The princess stood by a window, looking out at the endless desert beyond. The human remained near the center, hands folded behind his back as if still in the middle of a battle drill. Finally, she turned to him. Her voice was cautious, almost a whisper. "Do you hate this as much as I do?" For the first time, his expression softened. His shoulders relaxed. "Yes," he said simply. "I never asked for this. I never dreamed of it. But I accepted it because I have seen what happens when peace is broken. I will not let that happen again." The princess's chest tightened once more. His honesty was disarming. She had expected arrogance, expected cruelty. But honesty was more dangerous than either. Honesty could break her walls. She looked away, unable to meet his eyes any longer. Her hands twisted against the fabric of her sleeves. She wanted to believe him, but belief was dangerous. The chamber fell into silence again. The princess's thoughts swirled with doubt and curiosity, fear and something she refused to name. But before she could speak further, she heard voices through the thin walls. Advisors, whispering. "The human must be tested," one voice hissed. "He must prove his strength or he will never be respected here." The princess's blood ran cold. A test, she knew what that meant. A duel. Her people would force him to fight, not for survival, but for humiliation. She glanced at the human who had also heard the voices. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The princess's fear returned, sharper now. Not fear of the human, but fear of what her people would do next. The whispers beyond the walls grew louder, though the words were still hushed. The princess heard every one of them. The advisors were plotting, their voices sharp with suspicion. They doubted the human's strength, doubted his honor. To them, he was nothing more than a stranger who dared to step into their empire. And strangers, especially humans, had to be tested. The princess turned her eyes back to the man standing before her. His face was calm, but his jaw was firm, his shoulders straight. He had heard the same whispers. He understood what was coming. She expected anger, maybe even panic, but his expression did not change. He looked like a soldier who had faced this kind of challenge many times before. The silence between them pressed heavier than armor. The princess finally spoke, her voice low and guarded. "They will not stop until they see blood. They will demand you fight." The human's gaze locked with hers. "I know. Do you understand what that means?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "They will choose the strongest warrior from our ranks. They will not show mercy. They do not want peace. They want to see you fall." He tilted his head slightly as though studying her words. "I have stood against armies," he said. "One warrior will not frighten me." The princess felt a chill. It was not arrogance in his tone. It was certainty. But certainty could be dangerous too. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you kill him, they will call you savage. If you spare him, they will call you weak. Either way, they will despise you." The human's eyes softened for the first time, the hardness easing just slightly. "Then I will do what I always do. I will stand, I will fight, and I will let the truth of my actions speak for me." The princess's heart tightened. His words were simple yet heavy. There was no boast, no promise of cruelty, only a calm that unsettled her more than rage ever could. She turned away, hiding the storm in her chest. For so long she had been certain that humans were monsters. But monsters did not speak like this. Monsters did not carry sadness in their eyes. Before she could answer, the chamber doors opened. Advisors entered, bowing only briefly before turning their attention to the human. Their voices carried authority, their words laced with challenge. "The people demand proof," one declared. His eyes, sharp as knives, studied the human. "Our empire does not kneel to empty promises. If you would call yourself worthy of this union, then you must fight. A duel, one against our champion." The princess's breath caught. Her worst fear had now become reality. The human did not move at first. He let their words hang in the air, his silence heavy enough to unsettle even the bold advisors. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "If that is what your people require, then I will stand." The advisors smirked as though pleased with his answer and bowed before leaving. The sound of the doors closing echoed through the chamber, leaving the princess and the human alone again. She turned to him, anger burning in her voice. "Why do you agree so easily? Do you not see what they are doing? They want to break you. They want to make me watch as you are torn down." The human's reply was steady, almost quiet, because refusing would make it worse. "They would call me a coward, and your father would lose face before his people. Sometimes it is better to face the fire than to hide from it." The princess clenched her fists. She could not understand him. He spoke as if he had already accepted pain, as if suffering was just another companion to carry with him. And still there was no anger, no complaint, only a calm that made her feel restless. The human took a step closer, though still keeping distance, respecting her space. "You fear what I am," he said. "I see it in your eyes. But understand this. I do not fight to conquer anymore. I fight to survive and to protect what little peace I can find." Her lips parted, but no words came. She had nothing to answer with. His honesty struck her harder than any weapon could. That night, the news of the duel spread through the empire like fire. Crowds filled the city, their voices buzzing with excitement. The idea of seeing a human fight against one of their own was too rare, too tempting. They wanted blood, no matter whose it was. The princess stood by her window, watching the flames of torches flicker in the streets below. Her heart was heavy. She remembered the human's eyes, filled with something she still could not name. Sadness, strength, truth, it was all tangled together. She wanted to despise him, but the more she saw, the more her fear began to crack. Far away in the courtyard, the human prepared. He stood alone, checking his armor, his movements precise and disciplined. He did not speak. He did not boast. He only waited. The princess whispered to herself, though no one could hear. If he falls, what will become of me? The next morning, the duel would begin. The morning sky was gray, the desert wind sharp as it swept across the grand arena. Thousands of voices filled the air, rising like a storm. The people had gathered from every corner of the empire to witness the trial of the human groom. This was no simple duel. It was a test not only of strength but of spirit, and everyone waited to see if the human would prove himself or be crushed. The princess stood in the royal balcony, her hands tight around the stone rail. Her heart pounded harder than the drums echoing across the arena. She had not slept through the night. Fear had stayed with her, but it was no longer only fear of him. It was fear for him. Below, the human walked calmly into the center of the arena. His armor was simple, scratched from past battles, nothing like the shining plates of the Empire's warriors. His movements were steady, his face set in silence. He carried no shield, only a sword, held lightly in his hand. Then the gates opened and his opponent entered. The Empire's champion, a giant of a warrior covered in heavy steel, taller than the human by a head and broader than two men. The crowd roared at the sight of him. His weapon was a massive axe, its blade sharp enough to cleave stone. He raised it high and the people cheered louder, chanting his name. The princess's chest tightened. She knew this warrior. He had fought in countless battles, never defeated. If anyone could kill the human, it was him. The horn sounded. The duel began. The champion charged first, his axe cutting the air with deadly speed. The crowd roared as the blade came down, aiming to split the human in two. But the human stepped aside, calm as water, the axe striking only sand. His sword flashed once, striking against the champion's armor, but not deep enough to wound. The duel became a storm. The champion swung again and again, each strike heavy, powerful, shaking the ground beneath them. Yet the human never rushed. He moved with precision, blocking when needed, dodging when he could, striking only when the chance was clear. He was not fighting to kill. He was fighting to endure. The princess's eyes never left him. Every movement he made was careful, controlled. He fought not like a monster, but like a man who knew the weight of every strike. The champion grew louder, angrier, frustrated by the human's patience. With every roar, his attacks became wilder, heavier. At last, the human saw his chance. The champion swung wide, leaving his side open. The human's sword struck, cutting across the gap in the armor. Blood followed, dark against the silver plates. The crowd gasped. The champion stumbled, his roar turning into pain, but the human did not finish him. He could have. The champion was open, his chest unguarded, his knees weak. One more strike would have ended the duel. Instead, the human stepped back, lowering his sword. The arena went silent. The champion blinked in confusion, then in rage. He lifted his axe once more, trying to strike, but his body betrayed him. He fell to the ground, weapon crashing against the sand. The human stood above him, sword still lowered. He did not raise it again. He had won, but not with blood. He had won by restraint. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the whispers began. Some called him merciful. Others called him a fool. The emperor's advisors frowned, their eyes dark with suspicion. But the princess felt her heart shift in ways she could not explain. She pressed a hand to her chest. This was not the monster she had feared. This was not the ruthless beast her people had described. This was a man who carried power but chose not to use it cruelly. That choice spoke louder than any victory. The emperor rose from his throne, his voice deep and commanding. The trial is done. The human has stood against our champion and has not fallen. He is worthy. The crowd responded with mixed cries, some in cheers, others in anger, but none could deny what they had seen. The princess's eyes returned to the human. He stood alone in the arena, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, his face unreadable. Yet for a brief moment his gaze lifted to meet hers, and in that look she felt something strike her harder than any weapon could. It was not pride. It was not arrogance. It was exhaustion. Pain. and beneath it all a quiet strength that unsettled her heart. Then, as if the moment were too much, the human swayed. His knees buckled, his sword slipping from his hand. He collapsed into the sand, blood staining his side where the champion's axe had grazed him earlier. The princess gasped. Her hands gripped the rail, her breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she turned to her guards. "Take me down there!" The guards hesitated, unsure if such an action was proper. But the fire in her voice left no room for doubt. She would not watch from above while he lay broken in the dust. The arena shifted into chaos as healers rushed forward, but the princess was already moving. Her heart pounded as she descended the stairs, every step carrying her closer to the one she had once feared, and now could no longer bear to lose. The roar of the crowd faded into a blur as the princess stepped into the arena. The sand shifted beneath her feet, warm under the desert sun, yet her body felt cold, shaken by the sight before her. The human lay motionless, blood dark against the pale dust, his sword resting where it had fallen from his hand. He looked less like a warrior now and more like a man broken by the weight of too many battles. The healers knelt beside him, pressing cloth against his wound, their voices hurried, their hands quick. But none dared to touch him too boldly. Fear still lingered among her people. Even when the human was weak, he was dangerous in their eyes. The princess ignored their hesitation. She dropped to her knees beside him, her golden armor clinking as she leaned closer. His eyes were closed, his face pale. She reached out, her hand trembling, and brushed away a streak of blood near his temple. The touch was gentle, hesitant, yet filled with something she had not expected to feel. Care. "Stay with us," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The healers glanced at her in shock. For the princess to kneel beside a human, to touch him, to speak to him with such voice, it was unthinkable. But she did not care. At that moment, all she saw was a man who had stood with dignity when others wanted blood. A man who had fought not to kill but to prove himself without cruelty. The human stirred faintly, his lips parting. His voice was weak, broken by pain. "Did I pass?" The princess's throat tightened. She wanted to scold him, to tell him not to speak. But instead her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "You passed," she said, her voice trembling. "You passed more than they deserve." His gaze flickered, a faint shadow of a smile touching his scarred lips before his eyes closed again. The healers worked quickly, binding his wounds, preparing to move him. The emperor watched from above, his face unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind centuries of rule. The crowd was divided. Some shouted that the human had proved his worth, others that his mercy was weakness, but none could ignore what had happened. He had faced the champion of the empire and had not fallen until victory was his. Even wounded, he had shown strength unlike any they had seen. The princess rose slowly, standing over him. Her armor glinted in the sun, but her expression was no longer filled with fear. It carried defiance. She turned her gaze to the nobles, the priests, the advisors who whispered in shadows. Her voice rang out, clear and cold. "You call him ruthless. You call him savage. Yet when given the chance to kill, he chose restraint. When given the chance to humiliate, he chose honor. Which of you can claim the same?" The arena fell silent. No one answered. The emperor's eyes narrowed as he studied his daughter. For the first time, her fear was gone. She stood not as a frightened girl, but as a woman who had found her own voice. The human was carried from the arena, his body weak but his dignity unbroken. The princess followed, ignoring the stares, ignoring the whispers. She walked beside him, each step a choice. Once she had dreaded this day more than any other. But now something inside her had shifted, something she could no longer deny. Later, in the quiet of the healing chambers, the princess sat by his side. The air smelled of herbs and smoke, the walls heavy with silence. The human slept, his breathing shallow but steady. She watched him closely, her thoughts heavy. She remembered the stories told to her since childhood, the monster humans were said to be, the fear that had been planted deep in her heart. Yet the man before her was not a monster. He was scarred, yes, but those scars were born of battles fought for survival, not cruelty. His eyes carried sorrow, not hunger for blood. And when given the chance to destroy, he had chosen mercy. The princess whispered softly, more to herself than to him. "I feared you would break me. Instead, you have shown me strength I did not know existed." Her hand lingered near his, close enough to feel the warmth of his skin. For a moment she almost reached out, almost held it, but she stopped. It was too soon. And yet she knew that one day she would not hesitate. Outside the chamber, the Empire buzzed with arguments. Some demanded that the marriage be cancelled, calling the human unfit. Others declared that his actions proved he was worthy, perhaps even more than their own kind. The court was divided, the future uncertain, but the princess no longer wavered. She had seen enough. When the human awoke, his eyes opened slowly, searching the room until they found her. For the first time, she did not look away. Their gazes locked, and in that silence, words were unnecessary. Something had changed between them. Something that could not be undone. She leaned closer, her voice steady now, no longer trembling. "You are not what I feared. And perhaps you are what we need." The human studied her face, and though pain still weighed him down, his lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. In that moment, the princess knew her life had shifted forever. Once she had dreaded the human groom. Now she saw not a curse, but a choice that could reshape not only her fate, but the fate of two worlds bound together. And as the desert winds howled outside the palace, carrying whispers of change across the empire, the princess realized something even greater. She was no longer afraid.